Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Thank you all for your indulgence in shifting around a little bit. We would remind everyone in-house, if you'll make sure cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, it will be appreciated. We will, of course, post the program on our Heritage website within 24 hours for your future reference as well. Our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Dr. James J. Carofano, who is Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. He is also the E.W. Richardson Fellow and Director of our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. He's an accomplished historian, teacher, and leading expert on defense and homeland security policy, a graduate of West Point. He holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Georgetown University, as well as a master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. James, I'll turn the program over to you. Thank you.
So in preparation for this, I was going to say this kind of trite old American saying, but I actually, upon further research, apparently it's an ancient Hindu scripture, which is everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And I think it aptly describes American-Indian relations, right? So this was going to be the great strategic relationship of the 21st century, and here we are well into the 21st century, and we're waiting for this to be the great strategic relationship. And the answer is it will be. And we are on a course to take us there. But these relationships, people often forget about America as a rising young power under the shadow of Britain, and the century it really took for those two powers to come comfortable and accommodate with each other. And that is a great partnership where the roles have been reversed, but yet today we still have this incredible special relationship with Great Britain, where oftentimes no matter what battlefield we go to, we turn and there's a British soldier on our one shoulder and an Australian on the other. This is about a different kind of relationship, but this will be the defining relationship of the 21st century. I am confident of that, and I am most confident of that because of the work of our friends at the Observer Research Foundation and scholars at the Heritage Foundation like Derek and Lisa Curtis, because this relationship is going to mature only because of the hard work and dedication and commitment of people who are going to bridge the differences and highlight the common virtues and build the trust and confidence between scholars and politicians and leaders in both countries in a systemic way. This is not where you just show up and wave and leave. And I cannot be more proud of the work done by both the scholars at ORF and Heritage for what they are doing. And there isn't a greater testament to me the value of this work and what they are accomplishing than the fact that Ambassador Rao is gracing us with her presence, and I get to do the best thing of all this. I don't have to do the hard work on like tariffs or like visas or anything. I get to introduce an extraordinary woman who I think exemplifies the kind of leaders who, when we go back and do the history of how this relationship matured, her name will be high on that list. And I am most excited because this is Ambassador Rao's first public appearance at Heritage, and we are so honored and delighted to have her here. I mean, the words "extraordinary career" just seem very trite. Her assignments spanned many years, 4 ambassadorial assignments, including India's first woman ambassador for China from 2006 to 2009. She previously served in Washington in the capacity of Minister of Press and Cultural Affairs from 1993 to 1995. Doing the timeline, I think that was when she was 12. She also served in Moscow as the Deputy Chief of Mission. She was designated as the spokesperson of Minister of External Affairs in 2001, the first female Indian Foreign Service officer to hold that post. She has served as India's Foreign Secretary, the highest office in the Indian Foreign Service, from 2009 to 2011. It's an unbelievable, extraordinary career. We are so honored to have you here. Please join us in welcoming the ambassador.
Thank you so much for those words of introduction. No, I wasn't 12 when I was here in the mid-90s. I was grown up enough. and I'm much older now, of course. But when we talk about the promise to be fulfilled in the India-U.S. relationship and the way you spoke of it now, I'm reminded of, Bollywood again, and a movie which was a box office hit in the early 60s called Sangam, which really means confluence. And the song from the movie, sung by the hero, said, likened the heroine to the Ganga and himself to the Yamuna, which were the other two, main rivers. So much history woven into them, as you know. And whether the confluence would ever happen. And the last line said, yes, it will, yes, it will, yes, it will. So I just wanted to say we hope the same, definitely, and it is happening in the India-U.S. relationship. And having gone through the ORF Heritage Report on Beyond the Plateau in U.S. India Relations, I did that over this weekend, and I see that as a very important analysis of a remarkable transformation that has happened in the India-U.S. strategic partnership over the last decade particularly, and in the last 5 to 6 years particularly. But there's one thing I disagree with. It's the terminology of plateau, because it conveys an exaggerated sense of disappointment about where the relationship is headed, or the promise, as I said, the potential that remains unfulfilled. I think this only introduces a sense of anticipation, a sense of expectation about what we might achieve as far as the relationship is concerned, but certainly not a disappointment. I don't belong to that cohort of people who may feel that. I think all democracies like ours, India and the United States, have their internal political dynamics, and that definitely comes to play its role and contextualize what the relationship is about. So we must keep that in mind. You're not dealing with inanimate objects, you're not dealing with theoretical constructs, you're dealing with living, vibrant countries, democracies, with very complicated and complex issues involved in everything that we do. But I do agree with one aspect, and certainly I agree with a lot of what the report says, that we have to rekindle the strategic dynamism in the relationship. We definitely need to do that. But we can take inspiration and encouragement and hope from the fact that there's been a remarkable evolution in this relationship, and that it has truly become a multifaceted strategic partnership over the last few years. There is a convergence that I see today of strategic, geopolitical, and economic interests between India and the United States, and a very large, impressive canvas of collaborative activities in almost every sphere of activity between our two countries. And the dialogue between us is rich in comfort, in candor, and in content, most importantly. Now, when you look at the situation in the region, and no relations are just bilateral, I think introduced into the dynamic of every relationship is a regional context, is a larger global environment that influences it at every stage. And today everybody speaks about the shift in the geopolitical and geoeconomic center of gravity to the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as it's increasingly coming to be called. All of us have read Samudra Manthan, which was authored by Dr. Raja Mohan, who's here with us today. Very interesting, very compelling arguments he makes in that book. And the fact that all this is happening in our region, in our continent of Asia, I think has also had its influence when it comes to the dialogue between India and the United States. You see it manifested in the East Asia dialogue that the two countries have very successfully transacted and conducted over the last year or two. The trilateral dialogue between India, the United States, and Japan. In fact, we're having a meeting this week here in Washington on that, and a number of other dialogues on Central Asia, on West Asia, just to cite a few. And when you look at Afghanistan, and you can enumerate the shared interests that India and the United States do have when it comes to not only the current situation in Afghanistan, but post-2014, that the peace process in Afghanistan should be Afghan-led, should be Afghan-governed, that we don't want to return to the pre-2001 situation. We want the democratic institutions in Afghanistan to be strong and stable and inclusive, that we would like the Afghan security forces to increasingly be able to stand on their feet, and that we would like safe havens and any incidents of terrorism in our neighborhood to be dealt with firmly and to be eradicated. I think those shared interests definitely populate the dialogue between India and the United States today when it comes to Afghanistan. There is also the common challenge of terrorism that we face, and stemming from just what I said. And the Homeland Security dialogue between the two countries is essentially focused on that. We're going to have a meeting of that dialogue later this month when our Home Minister will travel to Washington with a large delegation of concerned officials to talk to the Department of Homeland Security and to Secretary Napolitano on these issues. Defense cooperation, I'm just talking of all the achievements and the progress that we've made in the relationship. Today, we're looking beyond trade, just trade in defense items and equipment, to technology development, to co-production, to co-development of defense systems. And that has been led, in fact, by Deputy Secretary Ashton Carter on the U.S. side and our concerned authorities. And that is another aspect of dialogue between the two countries and cooperation for the future when it comes to consolidating our defense and security relationship. Technology is very much a driver in this relationship, especially high technology. I'm talking of strategic trade concerning such areas as civil aviation, biotechnology, space sciences, nanotechnology. And all this, I would argue, should, if I have a wish list for the future, become infused with much greater dynamism than they have been in the past. So we have to focus our efforts and intensify the work we need to do in these areas. And when it comes to the trade and economic partnership, we need greater collaboration in innovation, greater bilateral private sector engagement in manufacturing, in services, in energy and innovation, as I mentioned, and so that we can see new corridors in the vibrant growth of commercial cooperation between the two countries. We need to move consciously with greater momentum on the bilateral investment treaty and train our sights on the exploration of advantages that will help us come much closer in such fields. On energy trade, in technology and cooperation on regulatory aspects of energy, the export of shale gas that has very much been in the news in the last few months. I hope that the Department of Energy will take its decision on many of the pending requests for export of shale gas, especially by for Indian companies, for India. And there is a lot that we can do, we are doing, and must do for the future in renewable energy cooperation, including solar and wind energy, and also on the availability of clean sources of energy, especially when we talk of climate change. And we talk of how we should address the challenge of climate change and how we build a sustainable development model that can incorporate our concerns about these issues. On the civil nuclear initiative, which is often spoken about and really opened the door for so much good that has happened in the relationship over the last few years, we are committed to providing a level playing field to all our international partners, as has been said on many an occasion, but we want to engage with purposeful, result-oriented discussions with the U.S. companies that are keen and that are committed to doing business with us in this field. Another pillar of our strategic partnership, and it's not just about security, it's not just about defense, it's not just about energy and civil nuclear cooperation, I see also a dimension beyond that, and that is concerning development. That is concerning how we can change and impact in a meaningful and beneficial way the lives of millions of people, particularly in India. And that is where our cooperation in education, in health, in agriculture, and science and technology comes in. When you talk of food security for India's millions, we need to make the agricultural dialogue between India and the United States much more robust. And we have to work on transforming Indian agriculture. That is where, as Mr. Rajiv Shah of USAID says, we need that evergreen revolution, which can supplant the green revolution of the 60s. Education has come to really occupy a very important place in our dialogue. Education and skill development, especially when you look at the youth bulge, as it's called in India, the demographic dividend, as many term it, and how do we enable, how do we build capacity for these young people as they complete their education and enter the job market? How do we skill them for the future? And how do we make that demographic dividend, as some have said, a democratic dividend also? It must be, it will be, but we have to enable it also in many ways so that it is prepared to embrace the future in a much more effective and much more contributory manner. This is a timely report. I don't want to take too much time. This is a very timely report that comes on the eve of the next strategic dialogue between India and the United States, which will take place in late June in New Delhi. And we're looking forward to Secretary John Kerry traveling to India during the dialogue. So this is one of the major events on the calendar for the next few months, apart from, of course, the Homeland Security dialogue that I mentioned. There will be many, many occasions for our officials and governments to interact with each other. We have high-level officials from the State Department also traveling to India before the strategic dialogue. And as I said, we have high-level visits also from India to the United States. I just mentioned the visit of the Home Minister. We have our Minister for Human Resource Development, who is also likely to come to India to Washington this month, and possibly also our Minister for Non-Renewable Energy, Dr. Farooq Abdullah, is also possibly coming here for a conference. So, as you can see, the embassy is going to be kept very busy in the next few weeks. But in conclusion, I would like to say that we obviously cannot afford to lose sight of the fundamental reasons that have led to the transformation of the ties between India and the United States. Our converging security and economic interests, the vibrant ties between our peoples. Just think about the almost 3 million Indian Americans who made the United States their home, and the way they contribute to the daily life of your nation, and also to building strong bridges of friendship between India and the United States. There are mutually beneficial connections between our entrepreneurs. Think of all the Indian companies that do business here and create jobs in this country, and likewise the U.S. companies that have done business in India for many, many years now. And ultimately our faith in the ideals of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And all this requires regular consultations, greater coordination, and sustained high-level political engagement. I can't overemphasize that. We need it between our two countries so that we stay on a firmly positive trajectory. Thank you so much.
So we're going to bring our panel up, right?
Good evening, everybody. Let me first thank the Heritage Foundation, Jim, Lisa, and Walter, who's not here, for according us this very warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here at the Heritage Foundation, one of our oldest partners, and with whom we've been doing substantial work over the last few years. I especially thank Ambassador Rao for being here and delivering the keynote address on the occasion of the release of this report. Thank you, ma'am. This is a work which has been progressed over the last few months, and my job is fairly simple. I am moderating this panel before you, so I have very little to say on this subject. I will leave most of the talking to them. By way of introductions, I don't think anyone on this panel needs an introduction to this distinguished gathering here. Lisa, as you all know, has been the India expert, and whenever we have any doubts about India, we always come to her. Derek has been looking at the geoeconomics of this relationship, and his remarks may sound a bit acerbic sometimes, but then it's only because he knows the area so well, and he is determined on seeking positive change in the policy environment on both sides. To seek a policy change that can bring the two far closer together. Vikram Sood, as the former head of India's external intelligence agency, yeah, you're right, the man licensed to kill. But now he does so with his pen as a scholar of international relations at the Observer Research Foundation. And then, of course, Raja, who is here with us, one of India's best strategic minds. The joke in Delhi is that it is Raja's columns and papers that in finding direction in the chaos that passes for strategic policy making in New Delhi, he often ends up lending a semblance of the same to the strategic choices which India makes. So that is the panel before you today, and as Ambassador Rao said, India-U.S. relations have witnessed considerable progress in recent times. And we are standing today at a juncture as the U.S. rebalances its strategy towards Asia, prepares for a drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, and continues to respond to the aftershocks of the global economic crisis. Both of us find ourselves at a critical juncture in history where we think, this is going to determine the future trajectory of globalization, the shape of globalization which we're going to see in the next few years. And it is this framework which is going to define the contours of the India-U.S. relationship, which covers the entire gamut of aspects relating to global governance, security, economic integration, all the aspects which Ambassador Rao covered. And at a time when a certain amount of pessimism, does dominate conversations in New Delhi and Washington, this report is actually steeped in a kind of optimism, which I think is refreshingly pragmatic. And it is indicative of the evolving nature of the relationship between the two countries. I think the key realization in this report is that rather than wallow in rather presumptuous hyperbole about a common geostrategic outlook in a complex and fast evolving world, the report says that the two must adopt a sharper and narrower focus on issues that are of common interest. And this demands that both countries, India and the US, look past their stumbling blocks, recognize common future opportunities, and this can only happen as a result of very frank conversations which help both outline their separate and substantial priorities, and within them discover their common interests. So whether it be economic engagement, defense collaboration, partnership in East Asia, cooperation for regional peace and security, these are all areas which are covered in this report. I will not talk much about them. I will just pass the discussion on to the panel. And as a first speaker, I'm going to invite Raja to say a few words. Raja, so that there is time for some Q&A at the end of this. Could you limit yourself to say about 7 minutes?
Thank you, Sanjay. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And it's been a delight to work with the Heritage Foundation. So we've done this, the toing and froing. Normally when you're drafting, we don't do like the foreign offices, but where you're fighting for every word. But at least in terms of how to frame the ideas and how do we develop this, I think it was quite a pleasure to work with our friends at the Heritage. Second, I think the ambassador's remark that the Plateau question. I think we knew that. I think that will generate some problem. But I thought one of the main purposes of this report was to address this whole argument that was being made both in Washington and Delhi that, look, where is this going and why is it not going anywhere? So I think one of our purposes was to actually clarify that actually what we frame in the report as a paradox, that actually if you look at empirically, purely on the basis of evidence, that probably this has been, the India-U.S. relationship has been the fastest growing bilateral relationship, both for Delhi and Washington. I don't think you can say, look, any other relationship for both our countries has expanded so much in such a short period of time. And that is a fact. Yet, you have this argument saying that, look, where are we going? Why aren't we going fast enough? So I think the essential purpose was to unravel that paradox and to show a way in terms of that, look, to appreciate what has been done, what is holding us back, and where do we go from here. I'll just say a few words on, why this argument that the relationship has not gone too far when evidence actually points in the other direction. I think partly it has something to do with the strategic cultures in both the countries, where the American attention span famously is short, and the Americans are impatient, want things done quickly.
Have you done yet?
Yes. Okay. And the Indians, of course, we are one of the slowest, that we don't change in a hurry, that India will take its own time in altering and moving from one framework of reference to another. So I think there is that basic problem in terms of the two very different cultural attitudes. How do we get them going at the same pace? The second problem, I think, the relationship was driven by political leadership. In a sense, as we all know, just 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and we were still talking about Kashmir, nuclear and all that stuff, and that it needed serious, substantive investment of political capital on both sides to force the pace of this relationship and to remove irritants, problems that had existed for such a long, for decades. So what we saw happen between 2002 recently was to eliminate most of these big problems. But then you can do quite a bit of it by keeping the bureaucracy out of the room, but finally you still have to depend on the bureaucracy to actually move things forward. And I think both of us, I don't know which one is bigger and more complex, but both of us have very large bureaucracies. And I think getting them to move in tandem, I think it's quite clearly in the defense side. We're beginning to work on that now. How do we eliminate red tape? How do we simplify things? While the political will is there, how do you sort out the procedural problems and how you get the two bureaucracies work together? Third, I think, is a bigger problem that most democracies go through difficult phases, and that post-2008, the U.S. is going through a more complex phase. India's own government, and I think post-2009, I think it's no secret, I think it's not just what the argument here, but many Indians who thought we were going to take off in 2009 suddenly went into a stall. I don't want to go into the details of that the problem, but the fact is that both of us post-2008 have got into difficult moments internally, and that at that point it becomes quite a bit difficult to actually push things. And I think that's the phase we are in at this point. The last point I wanted to make was on the whole question of the economic slowdown. U.S. problems we all know go from 2008 onwards. And India's own economic growth, which initially seemed to weather the storm, went into a problem mode after that. And the slowdown of India's economic reforms has partly cast a shadow over the whole story of India-U.S. relations, because without economics, none of this rest of it has any meaning or basis. And the slowdown, of course, it's slowed down in a relative sense from 8% to 5%. That's not, 5 seems good. But I think the sense that the kind of opportunities that India was seen, I think that is not materialized. And therefore, together, I think these factors, along with one, just mentioned one other factor, in democracies, we also have to talk up a policy to get things moving. I mean, I think both of us, in some senses, I mean, I think when we tried to move it in both our countries against a large number of reluctant people, there was a tendency to overstate what is going to be possible. But I think that phase is over now. The challenge today is really that as all of us grown up, we know that all things can't be rushed. Some things will take work. And I think the challenge for us is how do we begin to build on what we've already achieved. And the plateau is clearly not the last word. There are other mountains to climb. And part of the report identifies a number of things that we need to do. And I think we stretch from ideas on how to strengthen the non-proliferation regime, how do we cooperate in different regions, how do we work together on cybersecurity. So I think a number of ideas are new, so I don't want to list them all because I want all of you to read it. But I think there are a number of good ideas, and the challenge is at this point, how do we begin to move things on all these issues. And I think I'm quite hopeful that looking ahead, that the ideas in the report will provide a pragmatic basis for moving forward. This is really, finally, I think many of us, different sections in both countries have tended to argue from an ideological perspective. But what the essence of this report is that, look, there are genuine intersection of our interests. That is an interest-based approach without exaggeration, without hyping up, that it is possible to conceive of building a partnership on the basis of converging interests which are across the board. And the very last point I wanted to make, that how much the talk about a lack of progress, that India is not a problem for the United States. That, if you're a problem, perhaps we'd have got a lot more attention, but we're not a problem. We're not undermining you in Afghanistan. We're not creating problems for you in Asia. We're not cutting you short anywhere else. Similarly, for India, U.S. is not the problem. We've got enough problems of our own, both internal and regional. We don't have to go into that. So in whichever way you look at it, I think the number of problem areas for us are very few. The number of opportunities for us to expand the relationship are large, and the report's purpose is to really identify those areas where we can move quickly and to move forward in the coming months and the years. And we are quite confident that this will provide a good basis for further discussion and provide good inputs into the strategic dialogue, which is due soon.
Thank you, Raja, for pointing out basically that it was inspired political leadership which brought about a major shift, a paradigm shift in the U.S. India relationship, overcoming the inertia that had been the big hump in the process. And beyond this, yes, there is a wide field. It may look like a plateau, but I think there is a lot of optimism on where it is headed. Next speaker, Derek.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the economic relationship. One of the things is a multidimensional economic relationship, so you need to talk about the different dimensions separately because there are different problems and progress along the dimensions. And after I get down in the detail, I'm of course going to say don't get caught up in the detail, and this is what you should pay attention to instead. So I'm going to contradict myself, but one is a provision of information and one is the making of an argument. The provision of information, the thing that we think about when we think about U.S. India relations, and really any bilateral relationship, is you start with trade and goods. That's the core of it. If you look over the time trend, the trade relationship between the U.S. and India has expanded quite well. And so then you have the optimistic view. If you look at the comps, meaning comparable countries that are comparable in size of market, and from the U.S. perspective to India, it's not doing very well. The two economies are extremely complementary. The U.S. is capital and land rich, and India is labor rich. They should have much larger trade volume, much more diversified trade. It shouldn't be that jewelry leads both exports and imports. That's not a healthy sign. India should be a larger U.S. trade partner, really, than South Korea, certainly larger than the Netherlands. I mean, that's the other way, and this gets it to our is there a plateau or isn't there? If you look at the timeline, you say there's no plateau. Things are doing very well. But if you look at where India could be, there's certainly a lot more progress to be made. On goods trade, on simple goods trade, most of the problems are on the Indian side. The Indian market is not properly integrated because, for one thing that Indian audience is very well aware of, the lack of a unified goods and services tax. There are also discretionary barriers, for example, in agriculture. There's a trade-off, it's a very difficult trade-off for India between ensuring food quantity and then cultivating self-sufficiency in food. One thing, you want to ensure food quantity, you should subsidize imports. Then you get lots and lots of cheap food, but that hurts your self-sufficiency. If you want to make sure that all your food is grown at home, you can have food shortages, or at least spot food shortages. So there's some difficult choices. Most of them need to be made on the Indian side in goods trade. There's a lot of progress that should be made going forward. I mean, the India-U.S. trade volume, given the size of the two economies and their complementarity, should be much larger than it is now. Services and labor. Here the record is pretty good. There's a very large volume of services trade and labor movement between the two countries, really kind of world challenging. It's not clear what other bilateral relationship has this kind of integration of services and labor markets. And these are two of the three biggest labor markets in the world, so the scale is appropriate. The problem here is not the past, it's the future, and the problem here is not the India, it's the U.S. We've had a very successful services trade relationship. We've had a very successful partial integration of the labor markets, and there are people in the U.S. who don't like this, and that's unfortunate. I think their anger is misdirected. They're pointing at failures of American economic policy and looking for foreign explanations, but that's the battle in services. In services, if we can just keep going the way we are going, that's great. But a lot of proponents of U.S. India services trade and labor movements are on the defensive now. I think we're all aware of the immigration law and its possible implications for India. This is a very tough issue because there's lots of stuff in the immigration law. It's obviously not about India. It's about many, many, many things. But if Congress is going to pass a law that discriminates or otherwise unintentionally harms Indian companies, at least they should know. And I think the battle right here, proximate to the Congress, is to just make sure the education's there. No law is perfect, no bill is perfect, but we do want people to be aware of the progress that has been made in U.S.-India services and labor trade and not take it for granted or think it's a negative. It's far from a negative. It's a positive for both countries. Capital and IPR, meaning capital, meaning investment and property rights, intellectual property rights. This is where most of the U.S. complaints are. I think they're somewhat misguided. India does have problems with respecting property rights, but they're not directed at the U.S. They're internal problems, and their U.S. firms should not be expected to be treated differently than Indian entities. We've seen clear progress in a multilateral approach, bringing India into multilateral agreements concerning the WTO with regard to market access and multilateral agreements also with regard to intellectual property. I think in that light, the lack of interest that the U.S. has shown in the WTO during the Obama administration is quite unfortunate. I don't think bilateral engagement with India on this score is going to be as successful as multilateral engagement, but right now the U.S. does not have a forum for strong multilateral economic engagement with India. The criticism I have in India, as I said, is internal. It's not mistreatment of the U.S. It's the elevation of state prerogatives at the expense of private property. And that's a quick summary, very quick because it's all in the report, of the dimensions of U.S.-India economic relations. What I really want to talk about is a change in the way we look at this, and this dovetails with both what the ambassador said and what Raja Mohan said. What matters in big countries, and not because big countries are better, but because the markets are so much bigger, is internal reform and internal progress. And when you have more internal reform and internal progress, magically you are more open and understanding and willing to cooperate externally. And when you don't have internal reform and internal progress, you get something like, I wouldn't say tension, but a little bit of an economic standoff the way the U.S. and India have had in the last 5 years. So one criticism I have of the American business community is I think they're being myopic. They're focused on market access in India, which is the same size pie and we want a bigger share. That's only going to work so far. What really U.S. goals should be with respect to India is a bigger pie, a successful, dynamic, thriving India. And that is going to enable U.S.-India economic relationship to advance. The U.S. energy innovation, private sector energy innovation, has created the conditions for the gas export to India that the ambassador referred to. We have 2 deals signed this year That in turn, if you do, and we're a long way away from that, and there are many obstacles to overcome, but if you do have healthy American gas exports to India, would anyone be surprised if suddenly India's attitude towards foreign energy companies was better from the standpoint of the energy companies? When you have private sector in the U.S. development or in India, and you improve the situation on the ground, it makes the relationship much easier. So when people talk about, it is a positive. The U.S. should be selling gas to the extent that we have gas to sell on a market basis, not on the basis of State Department lists or national security clearances. That sale will improve if India is one of the customers, will improve the bilateral relationship. And that came from where? It didn't come from negotiations. It came from private sector innovation within the United States. Similarly, and I'm going to get to the Indian side in a second. Don't worry, I'll be criticizing India soon. The threat to labor and services trade here in the U.S. comes from low labor force participation. It comes from a failure of American economic policy. It's not India. India is not causing U.S. unemployment. Our own policies are what's to blame here. And if we can fix those policies, you will see much less interest in Congress in threatening visa quotas or demanding that investment money return to the U.S. instead of being spent overseas. So again, U.S. success in energy has opened a door to more cooperation in the relationship. U.S. failure in macro policy has opened the door to a threat to U.S. relationship. And now on the Indian side, I've mentioned GST. GST would help all of India's partners. It would help India most. I think many people have heard the joke that India first needs a free trade agreement with itself before it makes free trade agreements with other people. It's not an integrated market, and with an integrated market, India would be much more attractive. So the government has tried very hard, and I'm far from an expert on Indian politics, but whatever the barrier is, the failure in India to proceed with the GST has hurt U.S.-India relationships. Domestic economic developments matter to the bilateral relationship a lot. The other thing would be, this is very politically contentious, services trade is advanced, manufacturing trade is less advanced. Liberalizing the labor market for manufacturing in India would be very helpful in boosting Indian exports to the U.S. I know that's a very politically sensitive issue. I just mentioned it because it's true. We get soaring Indian manufacturing exports, relocation of a lot of production from China, for one thing, if there was a more liberalized Indian labor market. And then the last thing, and I'm going to cheat. I'm not over time, so I'm going to advertise. Varun Mitra will be here on Tuesday to talk about land property rights in India. A little conversation here are going to have. Land property rights are the core of all development in all countries. Until your agricultural productivity rises, you can't have people moving into manufacturing and services. And land property rights are contested all the time in India. But they harm Indian companies, they harm government projects, they harm foreign companies. A big issue in foreign investment is getting secure property rights to land. That's an example. U.S. macroeconomic policy is a big example. This is another one. If India can fix its own house or improve, the relationship will shine. If not, we're going to have more testiness and more disappointment. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. I think you lived up to the promise, and we enjoy that. Derek has been emphasizing that yes, market forces would ultimately are the solution in the direction that we should be heading. I'd just like to add a small bit to this. The fact is, there are certain, if you look at what has been happening in the past few years, there have been broad institutional changes occurring within the Indian framework. You must remember that India for the last 60 years has lived in deep pathological distrust of the market. Politically, it has always been living in distrust of the markets. But now for the last few years, if you unclutter the dialogue, the discourse which is taking place in India, you are seeing that respected institutions within India, the Supreme Court, the Comptroller and Auditor General, are today, what are they really saying? What they are saying is that government is actually an inefficient allocator of resources. Government should be stepping out of these business. And if you pursue on that path, ultimately, the goal towards more rational markets is not very far. So that is one deep institutional change which we see occurring in India. It is going to take time. It will take some time, but I think we're going to get there. Next, I'll pass this on to Vikram.
Thanks, Sanjay. This is my third visit to DC for a dialogue with Heritage. Foundation, and it's always great to be here with you. Lisa and I started this, proud to say, 4 years ago, and we've gone on. The relationship has developed, the ORF heritage relationship has developed, and evidence of that is this book. I got not very much time to say what I have to say, but I've been asked to speak on terror and counter-terror, and my endeavor would be to sufficiently frighten my American friends about what's going to happen next. First, the good news. That is that as the report brings out, there is certainly a lot of India-U.S. cooperation now on counter-terror, something that was sadly not there in the 90s, and we used to have difficult times. But that's history now. We didn't go into all that. There is a realization that about the nature of the threat and how diffuse it is and how deep it is and how lethal it is. And that since they have a transnational reach, we in the counter-terror section have to have a similar have a similar global and international reach to be able to counter it. We've had if there are any milestones, then it's 2001 and 2008 that gave a fillip to the counter-terror cooperation between the two countries. And there are, of course, problems. One of them is that the Indian side has there is a huge mismatch of resources and abilities, and we are unable to actually make full advantage of what the United States has to offer. Our police is extremely inadequate in many ways, and we have to reform that ourselves and not leave it to everybody else. The other important thing is that terror is like crime. Bangalore in India and Boston here are two recent examples of the continuity of this menace. We can have all the laws in the world, we can have all the cooperation that you can think of, but crime of all kinds is committed all the time. Murders do happen, escapes do take place. So also with terror. A state can pour in billions of dollars to protect its citizens and interests, but it still remains vulnerable to the sneak attack. And the lone wolf or the group operating without any organized section is an intelligence security agency's eternal nightmare. There is no way you can. There's no formula to handle it. And terror has expanded. It has evolved. It has made use of all the facilities that are available to the rest of us for furthering its cause. Old threats may have been reduced. Al-Qaeda may have suffered it in Afghanistan, but it now has franchises in Aden, Syria, Iraq, and in Africa. It has the support of the Taliban and the Lashkar-e-Taiba. I think here comes the issue for us in India, where United States can continue to help us. We live adjacent to the home of terror. That is where it starts. And unless we tackle it there, it's not going to, we don't have a chance to make it disappear. Pakistan may be a victim of terror today, but it's a victim of its own monsters. Worse, and I think this is something I wish to stress on. There is a growing radicalization in the Pakistani society as a whole, which we are missing out. And if you read even entirely the Pakistani writings, analyses, essays, documents, there is a section of the Pakistani society which believes that radicalization has gone much further than we actually believe. The Lashkar-e-Taiba is an organization which is one day going to be as lethal as Al-Qaeda if it is not stopped. It has the backing of a state. Al-Qaeda did not have the backing of a state. This one has the backing of a state. It has representations of various kinds in 30 countries, 35 countries. It is a Punjabi Pakistani organization. I would like to stress this because there is sometimes the belief that this is a Kashmiri terrorist organization, a Kashmiri freedom organization. It is not so. It is a Punjabi organization where the recruitment to its cadres takes place from the same village as the recruitment to the Punjabi Pakistani army. I would say, it won't be surprising if they come from the same house. Some years ago, we did a map of Pakistan, Punjab, and we found that everything lethal that exists in Pakistan is in Punjab. The army, the terrorists, the militias, it's all there. And it's next door to me. So unless we're able to tackle this, we're going to be having this problem. And we can see this happening now in the context of the Pakistan elections. No political party can campaign without the support of the radicals. The other day, the Pakistani Election Commission approved 55 names for elections in Pakistan, Punjab. 40 belong to Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the extreme radical sectarian organization. And soon after that, we had General Kayani saying that you cannot keep Islam out of Pakistan and you cannot keep Pakistan out of Islam. He was talking to his Kakul Academy officers, which is like the West Point in the United States. This is the message they are giving to their soldiers. So I, living next door, I'm extremely frightened of the route Pakistan is taking. There are killings of MQM and of the secular parties in Pakistan. There is intimidation. So we're looking at a situation that in a few years, when the United States pulls out of Afghanistan in a major way, it will have no presence in Iran. It will have gone from Afghanistan, and Pakistan is in a mess. And they're all next door to me. So for us in India, this is a scene that we would rather not have. This is a situation which we want our American friends to understand. And that we need not less, but more cooperation in handling terror. It has to be a much wider scope for exchange of intelligence, exchange of data, and the ultimate test of U.S. India cooperation and confidence in each other would be, I imagine that one day they conduct joint operations. As I said, the future doesn't look very bright to me, to us. We live in a potentially volatile area. And I hope I have frightened you enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram. I think what you're really trying to say is that it is our vulnerabilities that are going to make us find common ground in the times ahead. Now, for the last speaker on this panel today, and then we'll pass the floor on to the audience, I'll invite Lisa.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy. It's a real pleasure to be up here with my ORF colleagues, and there is one very important ORF representative who is not on the panel, Mr. Samir Saran, who's sheepishly hiding over there in the corner, but without whose contribution this report simply would have not come to be. As Vikram noted, we've been cooperating for over 4 years now. We've had 2 counterterrorism dialogues, one here in the U.S., one in India. A book resulted from those very productive dialogues. We did a report on U.S. India Australia trilateral cooperation, which was released late in 2011. And now we have this report, which we're hoping will have some impact on the discussions between U.S. and India, particularly at the upcoming strategic dialogue talks in June. I'm going to talk about the defense relationship and touch on how China factors into that U.S.-India relationship. So until recently, I think defense ties were viewed as the fastest growing part of the Indo-U.S. relationship and held tremendous promise for the future. The thinking was, in the U.S. at least, that the completion of the civil nuclear deal would herald this bumped up amount of defense trade between the two countries. And I think that's why India's decision 2 years ago to buy French rather than American fighter jets to fulfill its orders for 126 MMRCA medium multi-role combat aircraft came as such a disappointment in the U.S. But in reality, I think if we put that issue into perspective, India's decision really marked more of a lost opportunity to really advance the strategic relationship between our two countries rather than a major setback. And I say that because if we look at all of the contracts that have moved forward, there's been over $8 billion in deals between the U.S. and India, defense deals, over the last 5 years. We're training almost constantly, holding regular joint exercises across all the services at an increasingly complex level. But still, there is a sense that the defense partnership is not living up to its full potential, and there are many reasons for this. First, I think we have heard from Raja, and you'll see in the report, that India clearly does not have an interest in developing a defense relationship like that the U.S. has with its treaty allies, with South Korea, Japan, Australia, for example. There are still suspicions in India because of the nuclear sanctions that the U.S. held against India. And there's suspicions that have stemmed from what India perceives as contradictory policies toward Pakistan and its support for terrorism. I think Vikram hit on some of those issues. So there are suspicions, and I think what I'm trying to say is they're not completely unfounded. Second, India values keeping its foreign policy options open. This is its policy of strategic autonomy that we've heard so much about. And the idea that India really doesn't want to irritate Russia, with whom it engages in trade for sensitive military equipment, nor China, with whom it has disputed borders. And China, of course, is maybe about 10 years ahead of India in terms of military prowess. So for those reasons, I think you will see the U.S.-India defense relationship temporizing. Third, I think the perception in the U.S. is that New Delhi is focused mainly on technology acquisition as opposed to discussing strategically significant issues and operational cooperation. And this makes it difficult to give the relationship the strategic flavor that many in the U.S. are seeking. Fourth, there's a reluctance in India to sign end-use monitoring agreements that would ensure the protection of the sensitive technology that the U.S. Would be exporting to India. So this has also been a hurdle in the relationship. But despite all of these hurdles that I just listed, there has been some recent progress. And this is the appointment of a point person in the Defense Department, Ash Carter, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, working with India's National Security Advisor to streamline the export control systems in both countries and to help move through some of those bureaucratic rules and regulations and better understand each other's systems so that we can, clear the way for more military trade. I don't think any concrete progress has been announced to date, but I have heard that it's allowed an opportunity for both sides to air grievances at the very highest level, and it's spurred a more energetic dialogue among the government agencies in both countries that deal with export control policies. So in short, the defense partnership between our two countries may not follow a traditional path, and it may contain more hurdles than U.S. policymakers originally expected. However, I do believe that our mutual security interests, the desirability of American-made weaponry, and the unpredictability of China's rise will make our defense cooperation continue to grow into the future. So with that, let me say a few words about China. The keys to successful American management of its conflicts with China are its forward deployed armed forces, its alliance structure, and vigorous diplomacy. And while India may not be able to help with the first two components of the U.S. strategy, it certainly can play a role with regard to diplomacy. And I think the U.S. and India can coordinate policies to encourage responsible Chinese behavior and peaceful management of territorial disputes. But U.S. policymakers, of course, cannot assume that India will be receptive to every U.S. overture that seeks to shape Chinese behavior. India has no interest in being part of an overt China containment policy, and indeed, I think there are conflicting views within Indian strategic circles about how to deal with China. So I think this is something that U.S. officials need to take into account. Now, I think India has watched Chinese behavior in the Western Pacific with some concern. There have been a number of incidents in which Chinese naval or paramilitary vessels have challenged or harassed American, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Philippines vessels in all of the seas abutting China. There are concerns in India about Chinese efforts to strengthen its military infrastructure in Tibet. The Chinese have also stepped up the level of their military exercises. They've extended the rail and road networks in these areas, and these are steps that could potentially facilitate Chinese military operations against India in Arunachal Pradesh if a border conflict were to erupt. Now, it's unclear how the U.S. would position itself if a border conflict, God forbid, would break out. But I do note that the U.S. Ambassador to India, Nancy Powell, recently endorsed India's claim to Arunachal Pradesh, but Washington has been quiet with regard to the disputed border with China in Kashmir, the so-called western sector. Now, our report recommends that Washington support Indian territorial claims vis-a-vis China unequivocally in order to discourage Beijing from trying to disrupt the territorial status quo. Now, I think this issue has taken on some new salience in just the last week. The Indian media has recently reported that a platoon of Chinese troops has set up tents about 6 miles across the line of actual control within India in the region of Ladakh in Kashmir. Now, I think Indian leaders have downplayed the situation. The Prime Minister over the weekend said it was a localized issue or problem. The Foreign Minister, Salman Khurshid, plans to travel to China. He's keeping those travel plans on track in the run-up to a potential visit by Premier Lee to India very soon. So there may be no cause for alarm. I don't think that is in order, but I think it definitely bears watching. And I think this is an issue that does impact the Indo-U.S. relationship in unexpected ways, and it's something that the U.S. will have to factor in as it evaluates its policies toward India, this China factor. So I'll just stop there, and I look very forward to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. You, I think, brought out the very complex regional matrix of which exists in the region, and there are going to be a lot of questions, I know, on many of these aspects. Now, who do I call on for the first question? Okay, sir, you begin. In spite of Derek.
Jim Carafanos, I just want to make one short comment, which is I thank you for raising the issue about export control reform, because I do agree that that is something that is going to speed U.S.-India cooperation. And we've actually at Heritage been very supportive of that. Derek's done a lot of great work on that. And this administration has made, unlike many administrations in the past, actually made real progress on that. And I'm very optimistic that over the next 4 years we're going to continue on that path. And I do think it's going to, in a concrete way, going to affect the U.S.-India relationship. So thank you for mentioning that. So fine report, yeah, whatever. But what I really, so my greatest hit really in ORF Heritage report was actually the last report on U.S.-India private sector cooperation. So I was wondering if someone on the panel could maybe briefly talk about that and then talk about the reception and kind of where we are on that.
There was one there. Let me just collect a few.
A reporter from the Voice of America. I have three questions here. I read some, read some articles from the Chinese media that mentioned that in the near future, the U.S., China, and India will compete in Indian Ocean. So I'm just wondering, could you, Ms. Lisa, could say something about the U.S.'s strategic interest in the area? And the second is about the you also touched upon the question, what is the India's role in U.S. pivot to Asia? Because the Chinese also saying that the U.S. wants to use India as a balance in the Asia-Pacific region. And third question is about the, can Mr. Mohan answer that question? You mentioned that the U.S. and India relationship is the farthest growing relationship. So why is that so? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll address it to Lisa again. Lisa, in the 1940s, the U.S. had the largest aircraft servicing facilities in Asia, in India. And so there's a long history of aircraft cooperation, including the private firms. Now, the Indian Air Force, or the Indian Army, has 250 aircraft, just 250, compared to the U.S. Army, which has 5,200. And one of the reasons why this incident is taking place in Ladakh today is because of the lack of heliborne capacity that the Indians have. And the second related thing is the lack of howitzers now. We need, by we, I'm putting on my Indian hat, we need lightweight 155 millimeter howitzers in large numbers to defend either the northeast or the west. And so these are two huge areas of cooperation, which I think the report should have looked at, and perhaps will. Thank you.
I think we'll come back to the next round. We've had three sets of questions, which I think are addressed to Lisa, Derek, and Raja. So in that order, Lisa, will you please?
Yes. Okay, so the first one was the U.S. strategic interest in the Indian Ocean region. And I note that more and more people are using this phrase Indo-Pacific. And I think even the ambassador recently has made some public remarks in that regard. So I guess, I would point out that, yes, there is interest. There's always been interest in, the Western Pacific region. There's also interest in the Indian Ocean region. I think, India seems to be getting a bit more comfortable with the idea of the U.S. in this area, because, you know, there has been a history there, and there is still a great deal of suspicion. You know, if people look back to 1971 and what happened during that period. And so I think the U.S., you know, nothing is going to happen very quickly. I don't see any major changes in sort of the U.S. force disposition in this region. But I would simply say that, yes, the U.S. does have an interest in seeing peace and security prevail in the entire region. And, you know, any U.S.-India cooperation in that regard is going to be aimed at that goal, which is to maintain, you know, peace and security, and to discourage any kind of aggressiveness or assertiveness with regard to territorial claims. And so I think a lot of what will happen between India and the U.S., you know, may be dependent on the positioning or attitude that is taken within China in terms of these issues. And in terms of what the U.S. pivot to Asia means, I think, you know, we've had our own questions here at Heritage in terms of resources and what we see happening with sequestration and the defense budget. So we have our own questions about tangibly, you know, what it all means. But we are happy that the administration at least, you know, acknowledges and seems to be engaging at the diplomatic level a little bit more intensely and focusing on this region, because it is extremely important. The U.S. has a lot of interest in the area. And then I think the other question was on the lack of attention to the helicopter sales and howitzer sales that are happening between the U.S. and India. And that's fair enough. I think we focused mostly on aircraft sales and some of the other issues, but that is a good point. There are some needs in India, defense needs that the U.S. is filling, and I did mention that, you know, still $8 billion in defense sales over the last 5 years is not chump change. It is very important. And I think, you know, just the broader point I want to make, and this doesn't only pertain to defense ties, I think it pertains to the overall relationship. We have to remember that we started having very different perceptions of each other before the relationship really took off, you know, 10, 12 years ago. And so we have to keep things in perspective. When in the U.S. we feel something's moved forward, say the taking off of the Indian Space Research Organization, the Defense Organization, off of the entities list, which happened a couple years ago. In the U.S., we feel like that's a big deal. You know, that's a major step forward. In India, maybe they feel like they should have never been on that entities list in the first place. So I think we have to keep in mind the differences in perception. When one side feels that a major step forward has been taken, maybe the other side feels that, well, that should have never been there in the first place. Or so we have to deal with the differences in perception that were there from the beginning and how those impact our current perceptions of where the relationship stands.
Okay, I'll be brief because I see that there are a lot of people now raising their hands. I totally agree with Jim's point about export controls. The way I would frame it is this. I mean, here's a situation where the Obama administration has done the right thing and tried to get the U.S. government out of the way of private sector firms that want to do business on both sides, not just India, of course, but this time we're focusing on India. That's a second example, along with what we'd like to see is the free export of shale gas, where the government gets out of the way on the U.S. side. Both of those strengthen the U.S.-India relationship. I can't speak for the Indian response, but I think in those two particular cases, the U.S. has set a good example. And maybe as a strategic matter in improving the relationship, the Indian government getting out of the way and letting Indian companies be able to work more freely with American partners would also be helpful. Agriculture comes to mind immediately, but there are other areas as well. So not that U.S. policy is perfect, I don't mean to say that at all, but we have two good examples in gas and military export controls where the U.S. government, it is doing better, it is helping the relationship, and I think the same would be true as a strategic matter on the Indian side, and I'm using the word strategic over and over again because now it's his turn to talk.
Thanks. I think on the Indian Ocean, look, the U.S. has been the dominant power of the Indian Ocean once the British vacated their military presence east of Suez That was in 1971. So now since then, the U.S. has been the principal, the dominant power in the Indian Ocean. In the past, yes, there were Indian suspicions of the U.S. role. We used to talk about, all great powers should vacate Indian Ocean. But I think that has significantly changed. In a sense, actually today, we do work together quite a bit in the Indian Ocean, and securing the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean is a common objective. And then, those of you not familiar, there's an acronym called the IORARC, which is an Indian Ocean Regional Forum. In fact, India worked actively to make sure the U.S. becomes an observer of that organization. I mean, this was done at the end of last year. And in fact, I think the initiative started when you were the Foreign Secretary. So I think that we want the U.S. in. It's not that we're doing you a favor, that we would want a much broader framework so that you create a framework, a structure in which our interests are secure. So that takes me to the question of, U.S. using India. A lot of Indians would like to use the U.S. against China. At least a lot of Americans suspect that, if you suspect Japan is trying to draw Americans into the conflict with China. I mean, I think, look, we are too big to fit into anybody's pocket. The U.S. will do what is in its interest. India will do what's in its interest. So we got to find a way of working together to shape the environment in Asia. And neither of us is going to be subordinate to the other. I think that is the difference between India and the other treaty allies of the United States. So, but I think our interests are common. I think that is the whole emphasis, that there are many things India and the U.S. want to do and need to do in their own self-interest, and where their interests converge. Now, on the fastest growing relationship, I'm just making the fact that, look, just 15 years ago, and I think when I first came here, I think Ambassador Rao was also here, look, some American officials were questioning, is Kashmir part of India? That was a phase we were in just less than 20 years ago. From there, the political understanding, the political comfort level, we've come a long way. But it's not appreciated normally that, look, how quickly, how significantly, and how much distance that India and the US have covered. I mean, that was only the limited point I was making.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll just allow 5 quick, short questions, starting with the back there.
My question pertains more to the national security of India. For the internal terror part, I'll address it to Mr. Sood. Mr. Sood, you have said that in 1990s we didn't have good relations with USA for apparent reason, the post-Cold War period. But what happened when David Headley was demanded by India? There were Americans killed in the 26 November attack. So what about that cooperation? The second part is for Mr. Raja Mohan. It appears that the Indians lack any clear strategic vision of any type. So they keep planning to import energy all the way from USA while dropping Iran, which is right in our backyard. Of course, it was done to show solidarity with USA. And at the same time, our neighbors didn't show solidarity. They are getting a military aid of $1.4 billion this year. Thank you.
Sir.
My name is My name is Hasmukh Shah from Business Times. We have heard about the defense, security, and other terrorism area. But most important area of cooperation between India and USA is economics, especially investments, for which India's finance minister recently came over here and gave a very good presentation about attraction of India as an investment destination. U.S. Ambassador Nancy Powell recently made the statement in India that government decisions are taking such a long time that investors are not so much encouraged to come to India. But it's a good thing that Mr. Chidambaram has allayed their fears, and I think the investment aspects is very important. The other side is that U.S. needs the investments for its infrastructure. We need $5 trillion, and Indian investors are ready to come to America. So can you throw some light on that? So it's investment on both sides. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. To Mr. Sood's point, it seems that the situation in Pakistan is, consistently getting worse and worse and worse. You're seeing an increase in extremism. 20 years from now, you can have a larger percentage of the army controlling nuclear weapons that would be more extremist than it is today. So by default, wouldn't that argument lead you to think that, the sooner you're able to at least engage with Pakistan to, not necessarily get a peace treaty, but at least engage them in a way where they feel less threatened necessarily by an Indian presence or an Indian presence in Afghanistan. What do you guys think the major obstacles are to creating that peace today? I guess both you and Mr. Mohan.
Yes.
And is it actually possible to have a peace agreement with the civilian government in power in Pakistan? Or would it have to be done with a military government?
My question also relates to Pakistan. Just a few years ago, before one of these Indo-U.S strategic dialogues, I asked the Indian Foreign Secretary, are you discussing Pakistan? And he said no, which to me is absolutely absurd. The two countries should be discussing Pakistan the way Mr. Sood is pointing out. So my question is, are they now discussing Pakistan? Because it seems the U.S. is still going in two divergent paths. A trilateral with Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then a trilateral with India and Afghanistan. Where does the U.S. stand on the subject of Pakistan and how to control the epicenter of terrorism?
Okay, I think we'll start with you, Raja.
Okay, I think on the strategic vision, look, most Indians also keep saying, look, the government of India has no strategic vision. But look, the question of importing energy resources has nothing to do with vision. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. India is importing coal from Australia, from Mozambique, because today, soon in another few years, when 40% of India's coal is going to come from all corners of the world. The problem is in Iran, it's not a question of getting more from Iran. The fact is, how do we bring it down to stay behind the red line that has been drawn by the U.S. Congress? And no Indian company is going to put itself in line to invite American sanctions when you say, look, I'm going to defy the United States and going to get more oil from Iran. I mean, I think that is not vision, that is suicide. So we're not on that path. The second thing is that it is about that Iran is an important neighbor, that we got to keep engaging Iran. And in some areas, actually, the U.S. has supported us. I mean, in infrastructure development, when we said, look, we got to create more access points to Afghanistan, the U.S. has also supported that. So it's depending on the situation. So given the American politics, the state of the American law today, all Asian countries, it's not just us, China, Japan, Korea, and India are the largest importers of oil from Iran. But all of them are struggling to find a way of adjusting to the reality that there is a confrontation between US and Iran. So that is what constrains the current situation. And I think I don't see any escape from that in the short term. So then if you get oil wherever you are, whichever corner of the world, we're going to get it. If the Americans are willing to sell, good for them, good for us. So because India imports 90% of its oil from all over the world. On India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Look, I think the argument that India is the problem in Afghanistan for Pakistan. Look, this is the most oversold untruth in the world, and certainly in this town. Ambassador Rao has just left. I mean, she asked the Pakistani, look, we are ready to talk to you on Afghanistan, on your concerns about our presence in Afghanistan. Can we talk? They're not willing. So there is a history between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which has very little to do with India. In fact, Afghanistan was the only country that objected to Pakistan's participation in membership of the United Nations in 1947. Because Afghanistan does not want the Pakistanis inheriting the claims of the British Raj that we have a special role in Afghanistan. But Pakistan wants to maintain that special role in Afghanistan. You never hear the Pakistanis talk about an equal relationship with Afghanistan. They say we want a special relationship. We want privileges in Afghanistan, which are not denied to the others. So that is the problem. India is prepared to talk. India is open to talking with Pakistan. But I don't see, the Pakistanis see they're winning. They got to see you out. Probably they'll do it in the next 2 years. And after that, they think they're at a moment where they can expand their influence. India is a relatively minor problem for them. Look, they can easily blow up Indian embassy, Indian businesses out there. Indian television will go crazy. it takes no time. So given our geographic circumstance, we can't threaten Pakistan's interests in Afghanistan. So I don't see, and in fact, we don't drop bombs on their territory like the Americans do. So for them to say, look, India is the problem, well, Americans are dropping drones every other day in Waziristan. So I think it's a nice play, but that is not the source of the problem. It's got to do with Pakistan's search for extending its influence into Afghanistan. The other point, in terms of the report itself talks about, that it talks about need for pressing India-Pakistan peace process. I think we missed a huge opportunity with the Pakistanis, the Zardari government, essentially because of the 26/11 attacks on Bombay. If you go back and revisit the story, it did two things. One, it put the Pakistan army, which was completely discredited when Musharraf left, back into the protector of Pakistan. Second thing it did, it constrained the civilian government from pursuing interests with India. So Zardari was very keen to do more things with India, but I think the shots on India, on U.S., on nuclear issue are called by the Pakistan army. We've tried to do the Pakistan army as well under Musharraf. We came quite close to doing things. So I think, but this problem is going to go to and fro, and I don't see an answer to that. We have to live with them. So we got to keep engaging them, hoping that at some point we can move forward.
Derek.
Okay, I am not nearly as optimistic as you, or was as impressed by the finance minister's visit. Essentially, he was focused on the possibility of very lucrative and important investments in India, and I agree with that. But we've seen, all the problems that have occurred. Why is India 5 trillion, sorry, not 5 trillion, 500 billion short and looking for foreign funding? Is because no one wants to participate in the infrastructure sector in India, even though it is possible for it to be very lucrative. I mentioned the first reason. The first reason is lack of secure property rights to land, trying to negotiate, who owns this land? The state has some right to the land, the people living there have some right, and the courts have to settle the right, and 8 years later, you still haven't settled the right. So that's the number one barrier. The number two barrier is that, Indian companies themselves, always local companies know the situation better, right? Indian companies are spending money in certain areas and they're not spending it on infrastructure. So if you see the locals don't want to spend money on infrastructure, as a foreign company, you're going to think, what, do I know better than the locals? Until India is enthusiastic, until India's private sector is enthusiastic about the situation, the foreigners are not going to be enthusiastic as a group. So we get back again, and I'm sorry, but this will be the last time I say it. If India can encourage its own private sector, it will help the relationship, it will encourage foreign investment, and so on. When the Indian private sector feels besieged, you can't expect multinationals to say, hey, what a great opportunity. They're not going to do it.
Vikram, I think there were a sizable number of questions for you.
Yeah, but I think Raja's done a lot of justice to the replies. I don't want to repeat all that. But the Headley question that was raised, when we say that 2001 and 2008 were milestones in the India-U.S. cooperation on terror, counter-terror, that the report also says, notwithstanding what happened in the David Headley case, we were unhappy, the government of India was unhappy that they could not get the kind of access they wanted to David Headley. Well, that's a decision between the two governments. We can just express our unhappiness, and if we don't go beyond that, I do not know in retrospect whether it was good or bad that we got access or did not get access. Perhaps it was better. Who to negotiate with in Pakistan? Well, as far as if you want to talk, who calls the shots? Obviously the army calls the shots. The civilians haven't called the shots for 65 years, and they're not about to change in a hurry. And I see no change in that pattern for the foreseeable future. The army will call the shots. We have a problem. We are the civilian government. Who do we talk to? We make the effort to talk to the civilian administration because that's how we work. And that's how most democratic governments work. But until there is... The core issue in Pakistan is the mindset of the Pakistan army, not anything else. They are the drivers of everything else that happens. As far as security and their definition of defense of the realm and protector of faith is concerned. It's their definition. So we are up against a peculiar arrangement that we want to talk, we want to get over it. There are moves made, and then there is something that happens that puts you back each time. And I don't see that changing, and I'm not very optimistic. And what was, Madam, you had asked a question about how the U.S.
Talking about Pakistan.
How India, the governments of India and the United States discuss or do not discuss Pakistan, and what
okay.
they're prepared to do together to deal with Pakistan.
I'm afraid I can't answer the first part because I'm neither in the government nor do I belong to the U.S., so I do not know how they would be interacting. But I do feel that looking at it in the larger perspective, there is a greater understanding in the United States of our position, where we also realize that the United States has a reason to be there. Our only worry has been that when it comes to well, Pakistan gets, how should I say, there's I think there is an exceeding anxiety to coddle Pakistan. That's the impression we have. And that gives it the courage to do what it has been doing. If that could be pulled back a bit, things might change. Thank you.
Can I make a quick point?
Yes, Lisa.
Okay, addressing the gentleman's issue, I think you said something about India reducing its influence in Afghanistan to make Pakistan feel more comfortable. But I think this is really a nonsensical way to look at the issue if you oppose terrorism, if you oppose the Taliban regaining influence in Afghanistan. It simply doesn't make sense. India supports the government, opposes the Taliban, the same goals as the U.S. and every NATO country that was fighting in Afghanistan. So I think that we really need to get away from this idea that if India just reduced its presence in Afghanistan, this would somehow bring peace to the region. In fact, it would probably instigate more terrorism, more problems for everybody in the world.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we've run out of time, so I'm sorry. There are a few other questions. We'll not be able to take them. Will you join me in giving the panelists a big hand for excellent discussion, which they have led forth? And one of the key features in the report is that deeper financial and trade integration across the region is something which India and the US can work together, and that brings us back to Derek's main point, that if we're talking of greater regional financial and trade integration, maybe India needs to begin from back home and bring about greater financial and trade regulation within the country. And that is a definite positive direction. I do not think there's any escape from that in the next few years. So with that, let us end this conversation today. We look forward to having your comments on the report after you've read it at greater length. Please email them to either ORF or to Heritage, and we'll be glad to get back to you. Thank you very much.